Uh,
I think we're live.
okay. All right. I just got a weird message. So thanks for letting me know. So we are live here. This is Kitty Shamlis, and I am here with Dr. Amelia Kelley again. Thank you so much for your time. We are happy to be talking to our amazing community here at Loving Without Boundaries, where we also are talking about creating healthy, open relationships and lifestyle freedom with a lens towards sex positivity. So we have a great topic in store for you here today, and I'm really delighted to have another, what I call a fireside chat here with Dr. Amelia Kelley. So thank you. I know that you are a very busy lady, and we both are, of course. So I really want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for this beautiful topic, for preparing some things for us to discuss, and for your valuable time. So I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I know. I jumped on at about 2:31. I said, sorry, I was ending a session.
Well, I get it. I totally understand. I was actually racing back from running an errand. So that's where we are. So we converged here to have this beautiful conversation. So our topic, and I think this is a really hot topic, so to speak, is about gaslighting. And this is really important, partly because so much of the work that I do is helping people be in a healthy relationship dynamic, no matter
Right.
what type of relationship they're in, but particularly if they are coloring outside of lines of heteronormative monogamy. So unhealthy dynamics can show up in any type of relationship. But for folks who are watching or maybe aren't that sure of what gaslighting is, would you maybe just start off just giving us a definition in your words of what that is?
Sure thing. So gaslighting is a manipulation tactic that is intended to throw the victim or target off base, make them question their reality, perhaps to get something out of them or change their ideals or behaviors to suit the gaslighter. It's a term that has been created to describe a human behavior that has been existent since humans.
Mm.
So it was popularized more recently by a play in 1938 in Britain that then was moved into the States as the award-winning film Gaslight.
Mhm.
And really, up until the last, I'd say, decade, and even sooner, the last 5 years or so, we've started to see more of a realization that this is a topic we really need to focus on and understand what it is and what it is not. Because, as we'll probably discuss today, it can be very empowering for groups that are not always in the majority to understand what the term means.
Mhm.
Um, Personally, my desire or my passion for addressing this term is
Mhm.
not just solely for the purpose of romantic relationships, which we'll talk about today, but
Mhm.
it's because empowerment, self-empowerment has been the driving force. Self-empowerment and self-awareness and education
Mhm.
has driven virtually everything I care about working on.
Mhm.
And I could never really put my finger on how do you really pinpoint the ability to self-empower. And I just kept coming back to calling out this action of gaslighting as a way to do that. So,
Yeah, I thank you for everything that you shared there. And this is why I love also talking to you, is you and I are in such alignment, because so
mhm,
much of the work that I do is also about empowering people instead of
mhm,
going into that kind of victim mentality of it's hopeless,
mhm,
I can't do anything about this, right?
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Especially when we're talking, of course, about adults,
Right.
we're helping them understand that they are empowered once they have a deeper understanding and the tools and the knowledge and maybe the vocabulary
Mhm,
and the discernment to see what is happening. So,
right.
yeah, so thank you for that. And I really appreciate too what you said, that it's not just about romantic relationships. Unhealthy dynamics can show up in friendships or
Mhm,
business relationships, or family dynamics for sure as well. So,
mhm, mhm.
um, what would you say are some of the ways that that people who are using that type of manipulation tactic, like, can you give some examples of how they might do that?
So, should we start with romantic, for
Sure.
instance?
Yeah.
Or
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah.
because I could talk for a whole hour on that question.
Okay.
So as far as, we'll say, romantic relationships, it can look like denial patterns where you're outright denying something that has happened. It can look like minimizing patterns where someone is devaluing or minimizing your emotions, making you question whether or not they are even valid to have in the first place.
Mhm.
It can also look like um, questioning your source of information.
Mhm.
So you can't believe everything you read, see, hear, research because your source is not solid. I mean, really, the gaslighter can very pointedly try to pinpoint anything, any argument, any justification you have as having cracks in the foundation, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, in my first book, What I Wish I Knew, that I wrote with my co-author, little
Mhm.
shameless plug there. No, I'm just kidding.
Mhm.
Um, she actually wrote about a very glaringly obvious form of gaslighting where her abuser had purposely hidden her engagement ring and
Mm.
then blamed her to throw her off and make her scramble to be the one apologizing. And it's from the outside in, sometimes you can look at the behavior of a gaslighter and just question what was their purpose, even,
Mhm.
which I'm sure we're going to talk about purpose.
Yes, absolutely. Well,
Mhm,
let's those are great examples, and yeah, that just is almost
mhm.
hard to wrap my head around in a way that somebody would intentionally hide a ring like that and then blame the other person for it. So yeah, I think that's a great segue. I'd love to
Mhm.
hear, why would somebody do some of those things? What is the purpose behind it?
Control.
Mhm.
I mean, that really first and foremost is going to be the primary reason or motivator. And the reason for the control can look different. So let's say hypothetically institutional gaslighting. The gaslighting of people of color or of women or of
Mhm.
certain gender presentations or certain preferences for open relationships or sexuality, things like that. People can want to have control because of fear, so that could be a reason that a whole group marginalizes and
Mhm.
gaslights and tries to make you question your values, make you question your sense of reality.
Mhm.
um, you can look at institutional gaslighting in a structural setting, such as, let's say, work.
Mhm. Yeah.
Someone really wants to get to the top, and the only way to get to the top is to make other people feel less than or make other people doubt themselves or shift and shape them in a way that benefits you primarily. So
Mhm.
the person may decide to use gaslighting as a tactic.
Mhm.
There are other ways. Okay, so for example, the typical movie where everyone's in marketing, because I feel like everyone's in marketing in sexy movies because it's like fun. Like, oh, we all come up with zippy things and we have these meetings. And I don't know. I don't know why it's in so many movies. But do you ever notice there's like the moment where the person who wants to get ahead steals someone else's idea
Yes.
and brings it to the meeting and shares it, and then the originator of the idea is sitting there like, what do I do,
Mhm.
if the character A, the person who stole the idea, later says, well, all's fair, it is what it is, you brought the idea to me and I decided to pitch it, that's not gaslighting. That's just
Mm.
being manipulative and that's being a jerk.
Mhm.
um what would be gaslighting is if character B, the one who had their idea stolen, comes to character A, the one who stole it, brings it to their attention, and character A says, I don't know what you're talking about. That was my idea. That's gaslighting.
That makes a
And
lot of
so that's
sense.
an example, right? So that's an example of how that could show up in something like a professional work setting in my
Right.
imaginary movie I just created.
Yes. Yes, right. Would it so it's so person B was calling out person A, and is in the
Mhm.
first scenario where they were being honest, that's them
Mhm.
just being a jerk and admitting it,
Right.
whereas the second one, they're essentially lying, they're recreating reality
Mhm. Yep.
and then posing that new reality as the truth, which isn't the case,
Yes.
causing the other
Yes.
person to doubt themselves and question themselves. Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, so that's really, really powerful. And it can happen in any type of relationship structure for sure.
Hmm.
So for the person, the target, or if we want to call them also the victim, what might be some of the like the ramifications or the consequences if they are being gaslit over and over again? I mean, certainly it would maybe damage their sense of self-worth. Like what else might they feel?
Well, self-worth is a huge issue,
Mhm,
which if you think about when we have a faltered sense of self-worth, it can also affect our mental health, our
mhm,
physical health, and it can put us actually more in a vulnerable position to be taken advantage of further
mm, mhm,
by other people who might target us. That's why, one of the really unfortunate and grim statistics as far as trauma goes, especially trauma as a result of abuse, is that someone who's been traumatized is statistically more likely to be re traumatized or re abused,
mm,
unless they are listening to live feeds like this or educating themselves or getting support. So it's not a nail in the coffin. It's not to say that's always the case, but unless you are made aware, which is why it's so important to talk about this,
mhm,
unless you're made aware of what's happening, you're going to be more likely to be targeted again, unfortunately.
mhm. Yeah,
Mm.
it is a grim reality, but I hear what you're saying. So that's why I also just love to do things like this, whether you want to call it a public service announcement or whatever, but really being here to support our community, to
Mhm,
help them know that they don't have to stay in the again, it's another way to empower them, right? Like knowledge is
mhm,
power, or
mhm.
finding the right coach or mentor or therapist to work with to help you maybe see blind spots that you're not able to see. I sometimes
Right.
say, like, if you're inside the jar,
Mhm,
meaning like inside your own relationship, you can't read the label on the outside of the jar. So sometimes it
mhm,
can be helpful to have that third party to shine a
mhm,
spotlight on where you might need some help. Um,
mhm,
yeah, and I would imagine it would also like when it is chipping away at self-worth, like you said, that could start to ripple out where that confidence can just be kind of pushed down because they
mhm.
questioning their realities. So one thing I'd love to understand is I kind of view dynamics and relationships as like a spectrum. Like here's healthy, here's completely dysfunctional and toxic, right? But there's also
Mhm,
like a middle ground. If somebody maybe isn't sure, is there any way to delineate the difference between maybe we're just having misunderstanding, maybe
mhm,
you remember this scenario differently than
mhm,
I remember it. Like how can you
mhm,
differentiate for anyone who's listening when it's just
mhm,
like a misunderstanding or a different recollection versus when
mhm,
somebody is kind of maliciously trying to control or manipulate the other person
mhm.
for their own gain?
Right, okay, and so there's a multi-layered way to answer that because it's a multi-layered question,
Mhm,
and that's why it's so tricky to figure out. So,
mhm,
first and foremost, you can look at the history of your relationship. If historically speaking, this person has encouraged you to be your whole self, has not tried to minimize your strength and your self-worth, cheerleads for you in any way capacity and or is capable of apologies.
mm, mhm. That's a great indicator.
Right, capable of apologies.
Mhm,
Then let's say this specific scenario of misunderstanding is occurring.
mhm,
In that case, it may literally be like you're saying a misunderstanding, or it may potentially be a bad day, a bad week, a
mm,
rupture in a once healthy relationship where you need to reorient your intimacy. So, if historically speaking, the foundation is there, it may potentially just be a misunderstanding.
mhm,
Um, if the other person is habitually doing this as well, I mean, let's say even if a foundation seems like it's there because a gaslighter has to get it in some way. They're going to have to hook their talons in some capacity, and they're going to normally do that with love bombing. Some way to just be the ideal partner,
mhm,
groom the situation, be everything you want and need so that when they're ready to start trying to take over with their level of control, it's
mhm,
easier to do that.
mhm,
Um, but if you notice that, let's say it's one situation you and your partner can't agree. Okay.
Mhm.
But if you feel like they are starting to alter all the details around the situation as well, I might be curious about that. And if it then perpetuates and they'll string in other situations. Like it's almost like how tangled does this web we weave become?
Yeah.
Right? Are they trying to alter your complete perception of something, or is it just one literal misunderstanding? You told me you scheduled that appointment. No, you didn't. You did not tell me you scheduled that. So denial in one situation like that could be a misunderstanding. But they're both disagreeing about who scheduled the appointment, and then suddenly they're saying, "Well, you know what? You're just horrible at remembering things in general. I can never trust you. You're always doing this." Like it just keeps snowballing and the web gets bigger and bigger. That
Mhm.
could be more of a sign that gaslighting or,
Mhm.
unhealthy dynamics are occurring.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you
Mhm.
for sharing that. One thing I'm curious also in your work is, do you think that this is possibly becoming, like, more prevalent as time goes on for any reason, or is it just something that is maybe kinda steady and people just need to be aware of it?
I don't think it's more present. I think it's more noticed.
More noticed. Okay.
Right.
Mhm.
I think it's something that we're just able to not I don't wanna say finally, but more accurately label,
Mhm.
describe, identify.
Yes.
I mean, if you think about medical gaslighting, for instance, which there have been quite a few reports out, especially in relation to medical gaslighting of women, and especially medical gaslighting of women of color and other men of color as well,
Mhm.
that medical gaslighting has existed for centuries.
Mm,
I mean, I've mentioned this to other folks in these kind of discussions. Have you ever heard of the term hysteria?
yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
Medical gaslighting.
Mhm.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. That is a great distinction. I never heard this term put together like that, medical gaslighting, but
Mhm.
I love that we're having this discussion because, again, the more we can put a spotlight on these things, create that
Mhm.
awareness, that's
Mhm.
empowerment.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
just want to read something that came into the chat. I wish I could finish this. Oh, sadly, I'm at work, but thank you for the information.
Oh.
Absolutely. You can always come back and listen to the recording later. So I love that people are already getting a lot of value from this conversation. So thank
Mhm.
you. Yeah, so
Enjoy the
that's
rest of your workday.
yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, so that's fascinating. Just thinking of it in terms of a there's gaslighting in all these different areas, including medically, and it typically can happen to maybe marginalized or minority groups. So speaking of marginalized and minority groups, when we're talking about whether folks are identifying as polyamorous
Mhm.
or those type of different stigmatized people that are coloring outside the lines of heteronormative monogamy, how do you think in those specialized places there that gaslighting might come up, or it might be more complicated in those type of dynamics?
Hmm. So something that comes to my mind as you ask that question is in relation to the way that someone, whether it be a therapist, a medical provider, a coworker, the way that they or friend, family member, basically anyone, any human being, um, how they should respect your relationship and listen and empathize and be present for your relationship just like they would for a you said heteronormative.
Yes. Mhm.
I love
Well,
that term and it was like a tongue twister. Um, but let's say, for instance, you come to a therapist. I'm going to use a therapist. I would hope a therapist would not gaslight you, but let's use this as an example. You come to a therapist and you want to process your relationship. Maybe you've never told this therapist that you would consider yourself polyamorous, so that you have other relationships, and you're coming today to talk to them about it.
Mhm,
And so you bring the issue up and you say, these are some of the stressors I'm having in relation to navigating these multiple relationships.
mhm,
If the therapist were to question whether or not you really understand what it's like to be in a solid, healthy relationship, because of the fact that you're practicing polyamory, that could very well be a form of gaslighting.
Fascinating. Yes, and I'm so glad, especially as a doctor, as a therapist, you bringing that up is super powerful.
Mhm.
Instead of feeling like we're kind of pointing the finger and blaming the therapist,
Mhm.
because so many people do come to me after they have gone to therapy in good faith with good
Mhm.
intentions and feel like there's something wrong with them, like they're
Mhm.
being pathologized, and so I think that giving that example is great to be able to
Mhm.
shine a spotlight on that. So thank you for
Mhm.
that. I did think of an example in relationships as well. There's somebody in my life who was questioning whether they were polyamorous or not. They were monogamously married and then essentially started an affair. That's sometimes, unfortunately, how people do enter. And I'm one of them, so there's
Mhm.
no judgment there. How people might enter polyamory relationships. And so this person entered another relationship, and that person would say things to them like, well, why don't you leave your husband? Why don't you come run away with me to Europe? We're going to have such an amazing time. And is he still living there? Why is your husband still living at your house? So in other words, they were
Mhm.
almost like trying to pull them
Mhm.
away, what we
Mhm.
sometimes call like a cowboy, like a cowboy is trying to like lasso the person
Mm.
over to monogamy.
Mhm.
And I got the impression I've seen that sometimes where, um, whether it's a form of along the spectrum of narcissism, but starting to maybe gaslight in terms of turning that person away from their family members, whether the family member is like their
Mhm.
husband, or
Mhm.
also to kind of isolate them so
Mhm.
that again they become easier to manipulate.
Right.
So that's one that came to mind when we're talking about like multiple
Mhm.
relationships.
Mhm.
So I just thought I would share that. Does that resonate with you in terms of how that would show up?
It does as far as what could motivate gaslighting, lassoing someone and trying to sell yourself, sell your approach isn't necessarily gaslighting, however. This is I'm actually really glad you brought up the example because I think this is one of the big confusions.
Mhm.
About a month ago, I was on that psychiatry show. It's literally called that psychiatry show um, on XM, and we have live callers that call in.
Mhm.
Almost all three of the examples were not gaslighting. The caller would call
Ah,
in, they would give the example,
yeah,
and we'd have to figure out how do we navigate letting them know this is very toxic what you're
right.
experiencing, but it's not necessarily gaslighting. This
Mhm,
is why it's so tricky because usually it's not even detectable.
mhm,
That's what's so hard about it.
yeah,
So, let's take your situation that you had brought up about someone trying to lasso another person out of they're
right.
trying to lasso them out of the monogamous relationship?
Right, so the person in the middle is questioning if they're polyamorous or not,
Mhm.
and then the new person that they started an affair with is saying, "Why don't you leave your husband? He's no good for you. I am. Let's run off into the sunset together." The kind of things like that.
I could actually see where if the person is trying to alter the perception of the health of your marriage and make you doubt the health of your marriage. That
Mhm,
okay. That
yeah,
I could see it being. Do you see how you have to almost be so
yes,
specific?
mhm,
So if you could be in a potentially healthy relationship, but I as the gaslighter want to gain control over you by lassoing you in. I know you said cowboying, but I like I don't know, I'm
yes,
using
that's
lassoing, it just rolls off the tongue.
fine. Mhm,
But if I want to lasso you in, the only way I can get what I want out of you is to break the bond you have, and I can't break the bond you have any other way other than to ruin your perception of that bond, and so I'm gonna make up lies and manipulate your feelings around it. That would be an example of gaslighting.
mhm. Yes, okay, so I think in that situation, I don't have all the details, but that's
Mhm,
that's from what I've understood something that was happening there. So if they're making you in that case, it was making the person question the health of their marriage. And in
mhm,
that situation that I think is very relevant for our community, to me, there was also possibly them making that the person in the middle who was being lassoed,
mhm.
question whether polyamory could actually work for them. Instead, they were saying, "No, I want you to come into monogamy. It's either him or me. So I'm gonna make you question your relationship with your husband."
Right.
And, doubt around whether polyamory can work. And I'm
Mhm.
here and created this whole movement because it can work in a
Mhm.
healthy way. Um,
Mhm.
but it takes
Mhm.
people willing to do the work, right?
Right. Right. Mhm.
We have another comment that came in that says, is there a situation where I believe I'm being gaslit and yet the other person insists that it isn't gaslighting? Might need more information on that one, but yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and it has to do with a lot of factors. For instance, let's say hypothetically, the person gaslighting is a narcissist.
Mhm.
Many individuals, and I'm using many because I don't want to be definitive or black or white with this, but many individuals with narcissism have a personality disorder. Many folks with personality disorders don't see the world the way that other folks do. Their brains literally fire differently when it comes to empathy. And this is
Right.
research supported information.
Mhm.
Sometimes with my clients who are in relationship with these kind of individuals, I remind them that they speak a different language.
Mm.
Trying to get someone who is gaslighting you to understand your perspective sometimes is like if I started speaking to you in Hebrew and you started speaking to me in French and we're just not speaking the same language.
Mhm.
Um, so thank you for that question too, because I do want to put this out there. It is not always even safe to confront a gaslighter.
Mm.
And that could have to do with it being an abusive relationship. That could have to do with, the safety of your job. That could have to do with an abusive cycle in a family. So what do we do in those situations?
Mhm.
I mean, I have a lot to say about that, but I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah. And I think
Mhm.
that's incredibly important because there is a lot of the work that I do is around understanding our needs. And a lot of
Mhm.
our needs are also around certainty, safety, our physical well being. So when you are in a toxic, dysfunctional situation where you might be getting gaslit, you may not be emotionally or physically safe, both
Mhm.
in terms of how you're feeling and also in reality. So
Mhm.
how do you do that? Which brings me to, we mentioned that we started the conversation talking about empowerment. How
Mhm.
can somebody who maybe suspects that they're being gaslit or maybe knows that they are, how can
Mhm.
they empower themselves?
Mhm. So the very first thing, and it's funny, I don't want to say funny about gaslighting, but I had just posted on my Instagram, I think it was yesterday, about professional gaslighting I experienced a couple weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
I know. I'm literally writing a book on this, talking all about it, and I'm like, and now you're gonna you're gonna gaslight me. And even though I knew what was happening, I still had the same adrenaline rush, sick feeling in my
Mm,
stomach, feeling a little off kilter, kind of like a little mini panicky feeling in the moment when it was happening, and disbelief when it was happening. So following my own advice, the very first thing to do is to recognize if it's gaslighting.
mhm.
And so asking the questions about, is this person trying to alter my sense of reality? Are they
Great question.
completely devaluing my emotions altogether, making me try to question myself, making me try to question what I know to be true? And that can even look like picking up some literature on gaslighting or listening to a chat like this. So that's number one. Number two is processing with someone safe, not the gaslighter, however.
Mhm.
It is a very rare situation where I would say to process that with the gaslighter. So, after experiencing the professional gaslighting, I talked with my husband and I talked with a colleague and just kind of bounced off them my experience and just was like, you almost ask, am I crazy? Like you almost feel that desire to ask that,
Mhm.
or is this actually what happened? So getting outside validation from a safe person.
Mhm.
The next is then what kind of boundary do you create with that person if possible? Now, I know I'm not trying to just over assume. There are plenty of relationships where maybe you're stuck in the abuse cycle, or maybe you live with maybe it's your parent. Maybe you don't have the choice to leave yet. Maybe you're at your dream job and you need to try to figure out how to navigate a gaslighting superior.
Mm-hmm.
These are tricky situations where you don't always get to do what I did, which was say, "Thank you, sir, but I think I'm gonna go. I have another client. Have a good day." Click. And that was my option at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But not everyone can hang up on the person gaslighting them,
Right.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so first and foremost, figuring out what it is. Secondly, processing with someone safe. Third of all, identifying whatever boundaries you can have. The next step really is doing the things to fortify yourself further. And that gets to the self-care piece, that gets to the self-love piece. You know, reminding yourself of your sense of reality sometimes looks like connecting with yourself, being kind to yourself, being loving towards yourself.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, they have to also keep track of what they've experienced.
Right.
It's not, don't let a gaslighter make you feel like you're being irrational by keeping emails or keeping voicemails or keeping a journal. Um, Again, that's what Kendall Ann, my co-author, had ended up having to do eventually, was start jotting down what she was experiencing, because it just seemed so unbelievable that if you don't have a record of it, sometimes it's easy to question what you've gone through.
Mm-hmm. All great advice and tips in terms of how to empower oneself. Thank you for that. I'm just checking. Another question came in. We may have already addressed this, but it says, is there a situation where it really isn't gaslighting? Is
Hmm.
there an easy way to think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. If someone says something you don't like, I hate to be so plain, but if someone has a different emotional experience than you have with a certain scenario, or a different belief system about a certain scenario, or a different boundary needed about a certain scenario, that doesn't necessarily mean it's gaslighting.
Mhm,
Um, we can't agree on emotions. The way that you emotionally feel, even in this very moment.
mhm,
If I were to ask you, what are you feeling right now? You don't have to tell me, but if I were to ask you, what are you feeling right now? And then I was to say what I'm feeling right now, we're doing the same thing together. We're in almost a virtually similar experience, yet our feelings are going to be so uniquely different.
mhm.
And so it is virtually impossible to have the same perspective of situations. So if someone denies feeling a certain way or denies having the similar perspective to you, it may just mean that you're disagreeing.
Right. So
Mhm.
just simply disagreeing and having a different experience and maybe speaking your truth about that experience does not a gaslighter make. It just means that
Yes.
you're just in two different places and maybe just
Mhm.
butting heads a little bit,
Mhm.
or a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mhm.
But if one person isn't trying to like alter the other person's reality for their own gain, you know?
Right.
Mhm. Okay.
Right. So I would imagine, and I guess you could speak on this, coming from a more non-traditional relationship perspective.
Mhm.
I would envision you've probably been gaslit about your life choices before from folks.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely sometimes we use the term, I guess this is a distinction we can make. There's a term called microaggression. Yeah.
Yes.
So like to me,
Mhm.
there's a difference maybe between a microaggression versus being gaslit, you know.
Mhm.
So I've had when I have come out to people as polyamorous, they may say things like, you can't do that, you know. But to me,
Mm.
that's not necessarily gaslighting. It's this
Mhm.
them having a strong reaction, maybe from their
Mhm.
religious beliefs in terms of the way I'm choosing to live my life. And that person did
Mhm.
actually eventually come
Mhm.
around.
Mhm.
I actually feel like I have been gaslit more in friendships, honestly, than I
Mm.
have in romantic relationships. And
Mhm.
just like you said, I've had to create some pretty strong boundaries in those
Mhm.
situations once I realized like honoring what I have control over. I have control
Mhm.
over myself, my own
Mhm.
reactions, my own feelings. I do not have control over this other person and how they speak to me, how they
Right.
behave with me. So I just decided to spend less and less time with that person. I
Mhm.
decided to not be in a room alone with
Mhm.
that person. And
Mhm.
I was able to get things to a more healthy way. But I also
Mhm.
am trusting my emotions. Like sometimes I just don't like the feeling of being around that person. I
Right.
might start to doubt myself the way they speak to me.
Mhm.
Um, I guess an example is that individual was minimizing the importance of having online friendships. Like even you and
Mhm.
I never
Mhm.
met in person, yet
Mhm.
I love your company. I love talking
Mhm.
to you. And
Mhm. Agreed.
why minimize that, you know?
Right.
And this
Mhm.
person was trying to minimize the importance of that, like, "Oh, yes, you and your little online friends," you know? Um, and,
Okay.
would you consider that a form of gaslighting? Maybe
Yes.
I Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Minimizing is absolutely a form of gaslighting. Again, remember, we have to look at the intention behind the minimizing, right?
Mhm.
So let's say someone's just defensive and they feel shame around hurting your feelings, and so they minimize it. That's shame and that's toxic and that's a different issue. But if they're minimizing because they want you to stop valuing the thing you have the emotions about, or they want you to change your mind about whatever it is, then that would be gaslighting. So again, this is where it gets a little nuanced is it's you were asking earlier, how do I determine if it's gaslighting versus something else? And
Mhm.
sometimes it comes down to what is the person's intention? What is their purpose behind the behavior? Are they just defending themselves or are they trying to change or alter you?
Right.
Gosh, you said two things that are so super important that I want to make sure to touch on if you don't mind.
Sure.
Um, you mentioned microaggression.
Mhm.
Okay. We really, really would do a disservice to this conversation if we did not bring up microaggressions, especially when it comes to racism or gender or sexuality. You were saying religion, culture,
Mhm.
socioeconomic. I don't want to miss anyone. All of them.
Mhm.
Um, if you experience a microaggression and you bring it to the person's attention, and then they then minimize that it was a microaggression, that is the gaslighting.
Got it.
Got it?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay,
That's
that makes
powerful.
sense.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, because to
That's
me they are related, but I love language so that it's just a way to be able to talk about things that are hard to understand, right? So
mhm,
I love that. So trusting your gut, like if you
mhm,
do feel, hurt or
mhm,
offended by a
mhm,
microaggression, or like
mhm,
you being a minority is being minimized, and you
mhm,
bring it up to the other person, and
mhm.
a healthy response might be, "Oh, I'm so sorry," right? The ability to apologize.
Right, right.
I didn't mean to offend you. I'm so sorry. How can I make
Mhm,
it right?
mhm,
Versus them saying, I didn't do that, or
mhm.
I stand behind what I said, maybe, or what would the specifics of gaslighting be? Them denying it or minimizing the impact it had on you, or both?
Denial, minimizing,
Mhm.
questioning your authority for saying what you're saying, like that doesn't categorize as a microaggression. What a microaggression is actually this. Like that would be a form of it.
Got it. Yeah.
But the thing I think, I'm saying this as, a white cisgendered female, like it's my responsibility to understand that if I microaggress without realizing it, if I say something because I would not want to purposely do that, but let's say I did, I have to recognize the shame that the flood of shame I will get if someone brings it to my attention and have enough self-awareness to stop and at the very least say either like you said I'm sorry or maybe I'll further educate myself and we can use this in relation to what you were saying as far as people in non-traditional relationships like there's probably terminology I don't understand and maybe I say something and you say oh no that's you don't want to say that that's not a good thing to say so I could in that moment gaslight you to try to tame my shame
Mm,
to try to change your perception so that you don't really feel the way you feel. Or I can take a deep breath, feel my shame that has risen in my body, and
mhm.
then allow myself to admit when I don't know something.
Yeah, beautiful
Mhm,
distinction. And I love
mhm,
this conversation about shame or maybe guilt, guilt for, did I do something wrong? Oops,
mhm,
maybe I did. Maybe I should apologize.
mhm,
But I love this conversation because a lot of times when I'm working with people, we are talking about our emotions. And sometimes
mhm,
people will run away from their emotions or stuff them down or ignore them.
mhm, mhm,
Yet it's so powerful to lean in and get curious about your emotions because they're giving you really valuable information. And so I love
mhm,
conversation of, oh, I'm noticing I'm feeling some shame or some guilt. What's
Mhm.
going on here? And then be able
Mhm.
to ask some questions around it and then make a move. If
Right.
it's the person who maybe did the microaggression, the move would be, if they didn't intend it, right? Oh my goodness, I am so sorry.
Mhm.
I didn't mean that. How can I make it right? Right. Or
Right.
the person who receives that to say, that didn't feel good. That didn't feel
Mhm.
good. So
Mhm.
I'm going to use my voice. I'm going to
Mhm.
empower myself to
Mhm.
raise my hand and say, hey, now that just did not land for me very well. Can
Mhm.
we have a conversation about that? And then
Mhm.
collect the data of how that other person responds,
Mhm.
and then you can make it
Right.
about how to move forward.
Right. And with regard to moving forward, I think that would be an example of a time that it would be beneficial or safe to bring gaslighting up. If it's a person that you have a trusting relationship with and say they perform a microaggression, they're not aware, then they deny and they gaslight you to protect their own shame.
Mhm.
If you know that relationship well enough where you feel safe to say, okay, have you ever heard of the term gaslighting? Because it kind of feels like you minimized my feelings a little bit there. And you don't even never necessarily have to use the term gaslighting. You don't have to say you gaslit me,
Mhm.
but you can say, I am confident in my reality.
That's excellent language. I love that.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And I
Right.
love that too, just instead of using the word gaslighting, which could be triggering, just
Hmm.
say, I'm feeling like you're minimizing my experience or my emotion.
Yes.
Yeah, that was
Yes.
great too.
Hmm. Yes. There are ways to address it without, like you said, throwing the buzzword out there. Even though you didn't even mention this because it's so interesting. The term was the Webster's Word of the Year for
Really?
2022. And then if I remember the statistic correctly, it was searched 1,740 or 1,750% more last year than
That's
average.
interesting. That's probably
Mhm.
why I was wondering if maybe there's an increase, but maybe there's an increase of awareness. But I also just
Yes.
wondered if just the way the world has been the last 8 years or so,
Mhm.
there could be an increase in it. We won't go into any specifics of that.
No,
Yes. Go
but
ahead.
you can actually thank the state of the world for part of why this term started to be discussed a little bit more mainstream without naming names. Certain very incredulous, obvious forms of gaslighting were happening in the public political arena.
Mhm.
And because it was so obvious, it got people scratching their heads more.
Right.
And the term got unearthed
Mhm.
from the literature and presented as a way to explain what was happening.
Yes, which I think is a good thing. So there is some good things
Right.
that come from that as well, just that
Mhm.
we're able to have these conversations instead of
Right.
not educating ourselves or hiding it under
Mhm.
the rug or pretending it's not happening. Yeah.
Right. Mhm.
Another question, and I feel like then I'll just see if there's anything else you want to share because I want to respect your time too, is what if somebody accuses you of gaslighting and
Mhm.
you feel like you do have good intentions, or you didn't
Mhm.
feel like you were purposely trying to minimize their emotions. If you have the ability to be able to say, oops, maybe I could have worded that better.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
what if somebody's kind of like accusing you, like in terms of maybe a criticism,
Mm. Mhm.
how would you say to be able to either respond or think through that?
Well, I think going back to there's really two answers because first of all is checking in on your reaction and your potential shame response
Hmm.
and determining whether or not maybe something you had done in that moment was in a hyper protection of your ego. And if
Mm,
you were trying to hyper protect your ego, did you potentially try to change the person's perception of what happened? So take a pause, take a beat, and respond to that. If instead it was that you are feeling your feelings and your feelings are just different, knowing what gaslighting is and what it is not can be helpful right there because then you can say, I'm having this experience, you're having this experience, I acknowledge your experience. The reason I'm not gaslighting you is because I'm not trying to change your perception. I'm just telling you mine. It's interesting because
mhm.
I'm almost feeling like as I'm explaining this, that the person being accused might have actually been being gaslit. Do you know what I mean? In this original scenario, because it's not uncommon for a manipulative person to project their shadow onto someone else,
Right.
right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So
absolutely, because
that
that's
could
the way
happen.
to kind of confuse and deflect. Yeah,
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
to kind of, like, turn the tables around.
Right.
Instead of being accountable, now I'm gonna turn the tables and, call you the gaslighter. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. It's a tricky one.
Mhm. Pretty convoluted. Mhm.
Yeah, it really is. So any other thing that you wanted to share that you think would be helpful or relevant to maybe kind of, round out the conversation?
Well, if I were to look at, the reason that your whole, I don't know if I'd say group, your community
Yes.
exists,
Mhm.
um, I think the more times you place, the more power structures that are in place, the more potential there can be for misuse or abuse of power. So at the very beginning of a relationship, presenting your boundaries early on, presenting your expectations, figuring out what your rules are as a group or as just a single relationship. Even if you're someone who practices non-traditional or polyamorous relationships and you're just exploring, how do I deal with gaslighting from my sister or whoever.
Mhm.
Um the sooner you present your boundaries and what you are and are not willing to put up with in a relationship, the sooner you can detect if someone is trying to gaslight you, and or maybe, just maybe, the less likely they will try to do so in the first place.
Right, because you're also showing that you
Mhm,
know who you are, you have a strong spine, a good inner core,
mhm,
you're
mhm,
intelligent, you've done your homework. So just
mhm.
by doing that, you then become less vulnerable, like less easy for somebody to put
Yes.
their hooks into.
Right, and sometimes doing the homework for some people looks like going through it. So, if you have gone through a relationship where you've been gaslit, you are now equipped with the barometer of being able to feel and identify when it's happening very quickly if you really listen to your inner voice.
Mhm.
What you don't want to do, however, is get into a blame and shame cycle where you're not forgiving yourself for not detecting it in the first place. So
Mhm.
your voice and your self love is not loud enough to help protect you in the future.
That's a powerful distinction. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, beautiful. Well, this has just been an incredible topic. Thank you so much for
Oh, of
offering
course.
offering to share all of your knowledge and your experience with our beautiful community. I
Hmm.
can tell just by the engagement and the number of questions that have been coming in that they're really enjoying this.
Hmm.
So where can people find you and your work?
So you can find me on Instagram at Dr. Amelia Kelley, and that's Kelly with an EY. I also have my website, ameliakelly.com. I've just started offering some meditations on there, and we're putting together an HSP, highly sensitive person toolbox on there. I've also got some questionnaires so you can determine whether or not you're in a trauma bond, which is pretty crucial to figure out.
Mhm.
And I'm super excited, have a whole entire book about this coming out, hopefully by the end of the summer through Penguin Random House, helping to empower women who have experienced gaslighting.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, book number 2 about to drop. I'm so
That's
excited.
amazing. I'm so proud of you.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
thank
happy for you.
you.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thank
and for
you.
anybody watching, we're just really happy that you have found community here at Loving Without Boundaries. So if you have friends or family that are also looking to find a safe haven, a place where they can learn and grow alongside other people, we do our best to keep this community safe. So feel free
Mhm.
to invite them in, where we do have beautiful discussions like the one that we're having today with Dr. Amelia Kelley. We and my team are super happy and passionate about giving you the resources and the tools that you need to thrive in your life and your relationships. So thank you again, Dr. Amelia Kelley, for your time. You are awesome. And I look forward to our next fireside chats. And
Yes.
I'm always happy to support you in your work.
Oh, thank you. You as well.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great day, and we will talk to you
Bye.
soon. Bye.